Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. First responders are often given credit for running towards danger when others are fleeing. Who can forget the images of firemen and cops running up the stairs of the doomed Twin Towers building in New York on September 11, whilst others were fleeing? Strangely, that terrorist attack set in place a chain of events that led to today's guest becoming a witness to one of the world's most significant events in recent history. Today's guest was on the streets of Kabul in Afghanistan when Taliban fighters took over the city, following the withdrawal of the American and other foreign forces in Afghanistan in August 2021. Most people will recall those harrowing images of people trying to escape the city, clinging onto planes as they taxied down the runway. There was fear and uncertainty about what would happen when the Taliban seized control of the city. Most were sure there would be violent retribution, so people were desperate to leave. Well, today's guest, who lived in Kabul for 8 years, was safe in France when it became apparent the city would fall, but he felt compelled to go back to Kabul. Like the first responders running towards danger on September 11, so did today's guest. So while there were plane loads of people fleeing Afghanistan, our guest was on an empty plane heading back to Kabul, the day before the Taliban seized the city. No one knew what would happen. To say Kabul for an Australian citizen, or any other foreigner for that matter, was a dangerous place is a gross understatement. Our guest was not going back there to fight. The only thing he was armed with was his camera and street smarts in what was the world's most dangerous place. Today's guest is a photojournalist and was one of very few small group of journalists who chose to stay in Kabul, which was now under the control of the Taliban following 21 years of fighting. We'll find out today what drove him to go back to the city, which was probably the most dangerous place on earth at the time. Today's guest is a photographic journalist. He's a Multi-Walkley award-winning journalist and author of a fascinating book, August in Kabul, America's Last Days in Afghanistan. Andrew Quilty, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
It's a pleasure, Andrew. And look, I'll be up front, and I don't want this to come across as a man-crush type thing, but photojournalist in a conflict zone, that is a really... I don't know. It's a job that you would see so much.
Yeah, I kind of fell into it, I suppose. Yeah. I never I fell in love with photography before I fell in love with photojournalism, I think, or journalism more specifically. And I mean, I spent the best part of 10 years working outside of conflict zones. Firstly in Sydney in Australia as a photographer. And then it wasn't until 2013 that I ended up in Afghanistan kind of on a whim. So it wasn't something I'd always dreamt of.
You weren't drawn to the conflict zone. It was photography that was a path that you went on. I don't know if it pays the bills, but you certainly get to see in a conflict zone the best and worst of humanity.
Yeah, you do. And that's partly the attraction, I think, in comparison to working in a place like Australia where, you know, fortunately for us, we have a kind of a deficit of drama, which is, you know, makes it a great place to live, but a less exciting place to work as a photographer, I guess. And then when you, you know, you transfer those skills to a place like Afghanistan where, you know, life and death and the best and worst of humanity are on full display every day. It's it makes for potentially much more compelling photographs.
And it's to be there and the work that you do with the photographs. And I talked in the introduction that image of people clinging to planes as they get taxiing down the tarmac. If that sort of exposure is not brought to the world in places like Australia, we just wouldn't understand what's going on in an environment like that.
No, well, I mean, I suppose that's what the media does, right? The news is there for, and the photographers in particular, because you know, if you're not there on the scene, you can't get a photograph. Whereas if you're writing a story, you can potentially write that from the other side of the world by doing interviews via the phone or whatever. So I mean, it's the basic function of photography, and regardless of what kind of photography, to create a record of historical moment.
Yeah.
and then the news passes
And
on.
on world events, that was a defining moment. The end of a 21-year war and handing back of Afghanistan, basically, with the withdrawal of the American troops. But at the time, when it was, when I say from my point of view, it looked like it was going to, the Taliban were going to take over. You're over in France at a wedding, and you'd lived in Kabul for 8 years, and we'll talk about that. But I'm just here focusing on why you chose to go back, because I don't think I was overstating it, saying it was probably one of the most dangerous places, or potentially dangerous places in the world at the time, and you chose to head back when everyone else was scrambling to get out. What made you go back?
I was in France for a wedding of a couple of friends that I'd actually met in Kabul years before, and I was one of a number of friends at this wedding who had met in Afghanistan, still had ties to Afghanistan, or like me, still lived in Afghanistan. So we were sitting down basically on wedding day, and as the messages started pinging on our phones, the first of Kabul's 34 provincial capitals had fallen to the Taliban. And this had come after months of pretty significant and constant Taliban territorial gains across the country, but it was the first city they'd taken, the first urban space they'd taken. And so it was pretty significant, and we all kind of, our eyes were wide, and we were kind of wondering what this meant for us to begin with, and for the country. We kind of discounted it. We thought, it's not a particularly strategically significant city. So anyway, we got back to celebrating the wedding, and then the next day, 2 more cities fell, and then 2 days after that, 3 cities fell, and the same kind of momentum continued through the next few days, to the point that on the 12th of August last year, I was sitting down at dinner with a friend in Paris, and she looked at me and said, "If you don't get on the next plane, you're not going to get back to Kabul before the Taliban get so close to Kabul that the airport closes." And so I basically bought my flight forward there and then, and got on the next flight the next morning, rushing as you had to at that time to get a COVID PCR test.
Yeah, it seems ridiculous in the circumstances.
Did, I only just scraped it in to get on the plane. But I guess most people assume that I wanted to get back because I was a journalist, and or a photojournalist, and I'd been covering the country, living in the country for the past 8 years, and that I would want to be there for this momentous event as a journalist. And that's true to an extent, but more than that, I was part of the community there, or I was part of a community.
Yeah.
I had a lot of friends there, both foreign and Afghan. I had a couple of people who worked at the house that I was renting. I had a dog, and it was my home. It was my hometown, and it was my the house where I lived was there and had all my possessions, and the place that I came home to that felt like home, where I felt comfortable and safe for the most part.
That's interesting what you're saying there, because I think a lot of people would assume, photojournalists, this is where the action is, you get back, but that was your home. So it's what occurred there was impacting on you in not just your professional life, but also your personal life, and so it must have been a terrible time for you. I would imagine that there would be a lot of concerns for people that you knew in the town and in the city. Yeah,
exactly, and it really just became about, without sort of trying to sound too noble or anything. Yeah. I wanted to be around those people, and I thought, if I'm not, they're going to feel very abandoned.
Yeah.
Even though I had a limited capacity to actually do anything to help them, I felt like being there was something that I could do.
And that makes a statement in itself, because I can imagine, and we'll talk about your book in detail, August in Kabul, but what I really find interesting about the book, we're looking at that period of time, but from perspectives of different people that were on the side of the government or anti-government, and how what happened in that city or in that country impacted on so many different people.
Yeah, I mean, it impacted everyone. For those on the Taliban side, obviously, this was the 20-year war that they'd been fighting to win, to rid Afghanistan of the people they called invaders and occupiers, and so for them it was about liberating the country. And then for those on the government side and in the government security forces, it was, quite the opposite. Not only did it mean defeat, it also meant that they were now at great risk of reprisals from the Taliban. And then you had all the people in between who were not affiliated with either the Taliban or the government, but were, ordinary residents, civilians, who, were sort of on a spectrum of that dictated the degree to which they were impacted by it, and that goes from sort of senior civil servants or business people or young professionals in places like Kabul who had benefited greatly over the past 20 years after the Taliban were ousted in 2001. All the way through to, pretty poor farmers and manual labourers out in rural districts who had never really benefited all that much from the past 20 years and perhaps stood to benefit just from the fact that the war was over now and that they could harvest their crops for the first time without having to worry about airstrikes or getting caught up in ground assaults. It's
interesting looking at things from different perspectives, and certainly that's something that I've found since leaving the police, like looking at crime and hence the podcast I Catch Killers, but looking at things from, it's not all black and white, is there? There's always another side of the story, and I've found sitting down here and talking to people on the other side of the law from what I was, it's interesting getting their perspective on things that completely different from the view I had as a cop. But before we get into the details of the book, I want to find out a little bit about you, because I think it's a fascinating life path that you've taken for a variety of reasons. But you grew up northern suburbs of Sydney?
Yeah, I grew up in the hard knock suburb of Mossman.
So that's where you got your street smarts from?
Yeah. And went to a private boys' school, and never wanted for anything. And when I left school, though, the only subjects I really liked at school were creative ones, mostly visual art. That was the only thing I was really decent at and loved. Like that was the subject I looked forward to each day. And but I think there was a kind of expectation leaving a school like that you would go into a professional career, like you'd go into and you would go and study in the field that your HSC allowed you to get into, even if you weren't interested in it. If you got 99.9, you studied medicine. If you got 99.8, you studied law. Yeah. If you got 90, maybe you studied I don't know what that.
And that dictated your life if you followed that.
That's kind of how I saw it. Like regardless of what you actually were interested in doing. Yeah. And that it didn't really fit for me. So I ended up, I guess I tried to choose a middle way where I thought, okay, I like creativity, so I'll, but I still need to have a career. So I studied design at Uni in New South Wales, thinking I can, go into advertising or something, but still do something creative. And But rather than just going to study visual art and becoming an artist, I thought it's not a viable career option as I saw it. And but I did that for about 6 months and wasn't really enjoying it, so left and took off for 6 months driving around the country with a couple of mates in an old Toyota Hiace. And before I left, I was given a camera by an uncle of mine who was a photographer.
Right.
And a couple of days into the trip, the Toyota got broken into while me and my two mates were surfing. And the only things that weren't taken, apart from our boards and the wetsuits we were wearing, were a booklet of CDs, mostly Cold Chisel and Midnight Oil, and I don't know, there's probably even some Bon Jovi in there.
that might have been why they didn't take it then.
Well, I think so. Those and the camera that I was given. And so that was one of the things I had to keep myself occupied on the trip. And, I just took very basic photos of my two mates and our trip. And by the end of it, I thought, maybe I can do something with a camera. And so I came back to Sydney and enrolled in photography at TAFE and kind of went from there.
It's good that you pursue a passion, isn't it? For anyone in life, I don't think there's anything sadder than people that are stuck doing something that doesn't really rock their boat. But you've found something that you're interested in and carved a career out of it.
Yeah, I guess I was lucky in that I warmed to that. Like, it wasn't a dream that I'd always had to be a photographer, but I kind of found something in the general field that I was interested in that could work for me.
Yeah.
I guess, yeah.
And how'd you get a start? Like you studied, but how did you get a start actually getting paid for photography?
Well, while I was studying, I was working at a bottle shop, and one of the regular customers there was a photo editor at Fairfax at the time.
Yep.
And he'd come in, and at the bottle shop we also sold newspapers, and he'd come in every morning and buy all the newspapers, and often his photo would be on the front cover of the Financial Review. It was, and I started talking to him, telling him I was studying and interested in photography, and he really took me under his wing. He'd bring in boxes of film for me to use, and he was just very interested and supportive. And one day he said, why don't you come into the office and see what we do, and so I did, and I did that 1 or 2 days a week for a while, and then I basically just hung around long enough until they had to start paying me. Yeah.
That's a classic way of getting started in that industry, isn't it? Just being in there. So, Financial Review, you're taking photos for Financial Review. That would creative sign check, or what sort of photos are you taking there?
Yeah, I mean, it was a challenge for sure, and probably a really good training ground to try and make interesting photographs out of the kinds of stories that the Financial Review are writing. Those being mostly about business people and businesses and money.
Yeah.
Not particularly photogenic subjects, but you had to make something of whatever was on offer. And I think it was actually really good training, and you became quick and instinctive, and you'd learn to work on the fly, think fast. And then for me, the exciting jobs were court jobs where, you'd wait for someone to come outside of court. And at the time there were a lot of there's quite a lot of big white collar crime cases going on, HIH insurance scandals, and Renee Rivkin and people like this. And so for me they were the action shots. So waiting outside with a bunch of photographers, and then waiting in this scrum of photographers, and getting your elbows out all to try and
get the shot.
And so that was also good training, I think. Yeah.
There was in researching for the podcast, just looking at different things you've done. You also went over to Mexico and did some photography over there. What was that about?
Yeah, that was really just a long overdue gap year, I guess.
Yeah.
I suppose I sort of did that with that trip around Australia after high school, but I never did that that sort of year off traveling around the world that a lot of my friends had done. And so I did that in like 2009, 10 years after I left school. And part of that, or a big chunk of that, was spent with my uncle, another photographer actually, in the Western United States and in Mexico, where he lived at the time. And it wasn't really like a place that I went because I wanted to photograph it, but at the time I was photography was my passion. I carried a camera everywhere I went, and Mexico, happened to be a very photogenic place and a place that I love to be, and so the photographs I took there ended up kind of turning into a body of work that there wasn't a lot of meaning behind it. It was just kind of like a visual survey of the country, and that I turned into a book that I self-published, to little acclaim. That was kind of how I spent my days at the time. That was what I liked doing, wandering the streets with a camera.
Did travelling through Mexico, did that open your eyes to a world that you wouldn't have seen growing up in Mossman? Did that make you feel comfortable in environments that you weren't familiar with?
Oh, I see what you mean. I hadn't thought of it like that. I mean, possibly, yeah. I mean, it made me realise that despite what you hear on the news of a place like Mexico, where, if you really listen to everything you heard about that country, you wouldn't set foot in it.
Yeah.
You wouldn't even dip your toe in the water because it looks so dangerous. But it made me realise that, that's not entirely the case. I mean, it's not that horrific violence isn't happening in that country and that there's cartel drug wars and so on, but it's not the only thing that's happening in that country. And I spent 3 months driving around, camping by the side of the road with both with my uncle and on my own. And, it didn't, I survived to tell the tale and had a
there's a
great
bit of
time
xenophobia in there, isn't it? That we get scared of what we don't know.
Very much so, yeah.
So it's probably a good experience for you. Another defining moment in your career as a photographer, and you sort of rolled into photojournalist, but the Cronulla riots, which were a very significant event, a shameful event, actually in Australia of recent times. Do you want to talk us about your involvement in that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wasn't involved as I was a photographer.
I probably worded that wrong. So why
Just
were
to
you?
clarify.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, that was in the very early days of my photography as well. I probably got the first day I got paid to take photos was probably in 2003 or 4, and Cronulla happened at the end of 2005. So at the time, I was living on the northern beaches in Sydney and surfing a lot, and I was pretty tuned into the localism that was apparent even on the northern beaches there, where you didn't belong unless you were from there. I never saw it escalate to the extent that it did in Cronulla or in the weeks that led up to what became known as the Granola Riots, but there was definitely that kind of atmosphere on the northern beaches.
Potential for it to escalate.
Yeah. I guess what was different in the northern beaches was that the communities that are sort of based in the western suburbs of Sydney tended to gravitate more towards Cronulla and the southern and eastern beaches rather than the northern beaches.
Ease of access, basically.
Exactly, yeah. So there wasn't so much potential for the flashpoint as there was in Cronulla. Yeah. But it was partly that, and also, I was at a point where I was kind of trying to work out what I wanted to point a camera at. I knew I liked using a camera, but I still wasn't quite sure what I was interested in aiming it at. Yeah. And when the the rumour mill started running with talk of this, Leb and Wog bashing day, as it was known, in the lead up. I thought, well, yeah, I've got to be there, and I wasn't working for anyone on that day. It was my sort of. I didn't have a contract at Fairfax at the time, so I was sort of just a freelancer, and so I turned up, and I had I was using an old camera with black and white film, whereas most of the other photographers there, or all of them, were using sort of early generation digital cameras and working for the major newspapers, the Daily Telly, the Oz, and the Sydney Morning Herald, and so on. I'd sort of started to make friends with a lot of these people, and so I'd sort of become comfortable around them, and we all sort of stayed in contact with one another that day, kept an eye on each other, and were in constant contact to make sure everyone was okay, and what was going on where and things. But I had so I knew there was going to be a number of us show up, and I got there about 10 a.m. that morning, at which point it looked like a Australia Day, barbecue, Anzac Day barbecue or something, a street party with people had grills out the front on the road, on the main road, overlooking the beach. There were a lot of Australian flags and transfer tattoos on cheeks and this kind of thing. At that point, it didn't look as though it was going to turn into what it did necessarily, but the potential was there because, alongside every barbecue, there was a esky full of beer.
No, it was hot sun and
it was a hot day.
Combination.
Yeah, the sun was out, and it had all those. I mean, probably the kinds of factors that police look at and go, okay, we've got a recipe here.
Potential.
And, yeah.
So when it started, and I think people would be familiar with it, but it was pretty ugly scenes. There was riots there, and people were getting assaulted. And I often think, and I'd ask you the question as a photographer, like if someone was getting assaulted, you're pointing the camera. Do you still feel part of it, or are you separate to it? Like I'm trying to get the psychology of taking the photo. Like if I'm standing here with a camera and someone's getting bashed, your human nature is go in there and help them, but you've also got a role as a photographer. Did you find you were conflicted in some of the things that you saw that day?
Yeah, I don't think you ever really get used to that kind of dynamic, or that you're able to reconcile those two instincts, the human instinct and the professional one.
Yeah.
And that was definitely the first day that I was confronted by it. I was still very much sort of learning at that point, and didn't, on that day, as I said, it was the first time I'd been confronted by it. So I sort of had to, I don't know, I was just, I guess, I haven't really even thought about it, but I was, I suppose I was also, it was an overwhelming experience, and those scenes where you had, an overwhelming amount of force being applied to, one or two individuals. It was, it was a really, they were really confronting scenes, and, kind of, pretty scary, having not sort of come across anything like that before. And, I was probably, kind of tippy-toeing a bit, like unsure
what your role
what my role was, if I even, like, what did it say about me if I was, photographing this without, sort of stepping in. And, it's very, very difficult situation to reconcile.
It's complex, isn't it? Because I don't know what's right or wrong. If you don't take the photo, no one will know about it. It would be a difficult one.
Yeah, there were also a few blokes in there at the time who were, with, maybe you would call them protesters, because they were amongst the group, but they were also stepping in once it got violent on a few occasions, trying to protect,
slow it down.
Yeah, or trying to protect the guys who were getting set upon. And then I guess there were just enough cops to intervene just in time before things really got out of hand.
But it's lucky no one died. Really, it had that potential. How it escalated. But okay, I suppose that gave you a taste for a different type of photography. That it's different from photos for financial review. Is that where you saw your career? Is that you thought, okay, I can make a career out of that? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the photos that you used that you took were published, and you started to get recognised for your work.
Yeah, I did. I mean, it was definitely for me a day or the kinds of scenes that made me realise that there were subjects to look at as a photographer that weren't just about making beautiful pictures that actually said something or recorded something important. Whereas most of the photos I'd taken to that point were just the idea was to try and make the beautiful out of the mundane. And whereas the scenes that I saw that day, they were a pretty significant moment in Australian history, and a kind of a capstone on that political cultural moment in Australia.
Yeah,
and so it definitely opened my eyes to the possibilities. But I was still very early on in my career, and soon after, I think it was soon after I got a job at Fairfax, and I still thought that was great. I mean, this moment was. It's not like the Cronulla Riots happen every day in Australia, fortunately.
It was a very significant event.
Yeah, so it wasn't like, okay, I'm going to quit what I'm doing at the Financial Review and just focus on
wait till the next riot.
Race riots. Yeah. Fortunately enough, I would have been gone out of business pretty quickly, but I suppose, it probably sparked something. And as you said, I got a bit of those photos were published, and I got a bit of recognition, and maybe that sparked something in me that drew me more towards conflict of some sort or another, or even just human interaction. I mean, that's for me at the end of the day, that's the most important element in any photo, some sort of human interaction, whether it's love or hate, like
trying to capture that emotion
exactly
through the photos.
Yeah.
Your work overseas, how did you end up in Afghanistan? So that was 2005. I think you went to Afghanistan 2013.
Yeah,
roughly. What was the path before you got to Afghanistan?
So at the end of that gap year that I was talking about, I ended up in New York, and a friend of mine, a photographer, an Australian photographer, Adam Ferguson, said, okay, you're in New York, you've got to go and meet all these photo editors. And he gave me the names and contact numbers of 5 photo editors from, huge magazines, international news magazines. And he said, tell them I sent you, go and show them your work. And so I did. And, that week I went to the offices of, Time and Newsweek and Rolling Stone and the New York Times. And I was, pretty blown away. I never thought I'd be walking in those corridors. And it gave me a little, a taste of what was outside Australia in terms of the work I was doing, or the kinds of organisations that I could work for outside Australia. And so when I came back to Australia, I left Fairfax and went freelance, and I started working for some of those magazines, those newspapers. I think that the first big international assignment I had, or the first assignment I had for an international publication, was the Queensland floods it was probably 2010 or 2011.
Yep.
And I was working for the New York Times, and I felt like that was a bit of progression in my career terms, professional terms, and so I did that for a couple of years, and then I thought, well, if these are the publications I want to work for, I want to go and work where they are. I want to go to
Makes
New
sense.
York.
Yeah.
Well, it does in a way, but these big international publications, they might be based in New York, but they draw in stories from all over the world. Yeah. So it was a little bit naive of me thinking that, you know, I had to be in the city where they were based, because I went there and, of course, you know, I went from being, you know, relatively competitive in the industry in Sydney, to being at the bottom of a pile of 1 million photographers.
Starting your apprenticeship all over again.
Exactly. And, you know, being at the bottom of everyone's contact list, and having to, you know, go around and hobnob and network and all that crap that I realized I didn't like.
Yeah.
After having to do it for a year or two. And it was in probably mid to 2013 that a friend of mine from Fairfax got in touch and told me she was going over to Afghanistan. She wanted to write a story about the Afghan cricket team. They were preparing for their first World Cup, which was going to be in Australia the next year. And she said, do you know any photographers I could work with over there? And I didn't, or I did, perhaps I did, but I said, without really even thinking about it, well, I'll come with you. Yeah. And that was it. We left late that year, and we were going to spend 2 weeks there, and then go to northern Iraq to try and do a little bit of work there. But it was a you know, kind of stepping off into the unknown for both of us, and we were both very green in those kinds of environments. We had a couple of friends, a few contacts and things, and someone to meet us when we got off the plane. But we were very green and wide-eyed when we got there, and that was late 2013. We were meant to stay for 2 weeks, and I ended up staying for nearly 10 years.
Okay, well, that's what was it about Afghanistan that kept you there? Now, and can I just clarify? So 2013, it was a conflict zone. The war was going on. The international forces were there. I think a lot of attention had gone over to Iraq at the time, but the conflict was still going on in Afghanistan. When people put myself in that category, we watch and we see the images that come back there, you think a war zone and life couldn't be normal, but it is in fact normal over there. People get on with their lives.
Yeah, it was a different kind of normal. Yeah. Kabul was very militarized, and, you know, I hadn't really been in a place where, apart from we'd spent a couple of weeks in Lebanon before we'd come there, and in the north of Lebanon at the time was pretty, there was quite a bit of violence and was quite militarized. But Kabul was another level. It was, you know, all the major buildings and infrastructure were surrounded by these high concrete blast walls to protect them from suicide bombers and car and truck bombs, and the police and military all carried, you know, automatic weapons, and there was, you know, the news of the war happening outside Kabul was constant, and occasionally it would come inside the walls of Kabul, and so life, there was a bit of normality to it, but there was always this atmosphere of threat that permeated the days there, and I suppose that you know, that becomes a little bit intoxicating as well when and I think when you lay that over the top of an otherwise, you know, functioning city with, you know, 5 or 6 million people going about their day-to-day lives, it adds an element of power to the photographs, and to, as it does to the or it adds an element of how would I describe it? I mean, it makes the lives that the people in a city like that are living somehow more compelling as a photographer and a storyteller. When you know, for you or I walking to the office in Sydney of a morning, it's 999 times out of 1,000, it's going to be uneventful. Yeah. Whereas in Kabul, that journey to and from work every morning, every afternoon, there was the chance that you would get caught up in a suicide bombing or something, or that, or more likely that one of your relatives who was fighting the war out in the provinces would come home in a box, and so having that layer over the top of daily life, it just added something to the work that I was doing. Even if I was just photographing day-to-day life on the streets, that layer over everything added power to the photographs I felt.
Did you find that type of environment that you would be, let's put it this way, celebrating? Like if you've got a moment of joy, you embrace that. You've got to virtually live for the moment. That, as you said, if you're going in the city, it might be a suicide bomber. So did it make life more vivid, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it did, definitely. And the times you would spend with friends, for example, I mean, some of the fondest memories I have in Kabul were nights spent with friends after a day where there had been an attack in the city, a violent attack, and where a lot of my friends, many among them journalists, would have spent that day covering the event, or others might have been, they might have spent the afternoon locked up in a safe room in the basement of their office or something, trying to get updates on their phone about what was happening, where the attack was happening, who was involved, how many casualties and things. And then, once things inevitably died down, as they usually did within a number of hours, and, I filed my photos and my friends filed their stories, we'd inevitably come together that night and come together for a drink, and the bonds that were formed with that kind of thing happening in the background are much stronger. And it's you love harder and you fight harder, and all the senses are heightened. Exactly.
Yeah. So you made it 8 years. When did you decide this is my home? When did you start to feel like Kabul was your home? This is where I'm going to spend my time.
Yeah, good question. I for a number of years, I think I always thought I was, 6 months away from going home, and that's part of my excuse for having been so bad learning the language, because I always thought, I'll be packing up, in 3 to 6 months, so there's not so much point learning the language. Yep. And then 3 to 6 months would come and go, and I was still there, and with no making no moves to leave. And then after a few years, you become, you start to understand things a bit better, and the country more, and then people come to you because of that knowledge, and they call on you for your expertise or whatever, and you get a bit of a reputation as a photographer that lives in Kabul, and that people can, clients can, photo editors and clients can come to, and because they know you're there and the situation, they can trust you to conduct your work, as well as anyone. And then on top of that, I developed a good friendship group, and lived in nice homes with big gardens and dogs and chickens and veggie gardens and rose beds. It was life despite the risks was pretty nice there. You could live cheaply. Life was also very simple. There was nothing to spend your money on.
All the distractions that we find over here.
Yeah, exactly. The things that are kind of almost necessary here to lubricate social interaction. There, they didn't exist. I mean, okay, so you could get alcohol there, which was still helped. Yeah. But there were no bars, restaurants by that point that were frequented by foreigners up until 2013-14 were all closing down because they were getting targeted because of their
attracting the foreigners.
Yep. and you couldn't. It was becoming increasingly difficult to do like weekend road trips to go out of Kabul for picnics or a night away in a sort of quiet town. So all you really had were your close friends, and for me, a motorcycle. I bought a motorcycle, and that gave me a lot of freedom that I didn't have to that point. To get around Kabul and in relative anonymity, I'd stick a helmet on and I could ride around all day. I really loved doing that on Fridays, which was their version of Sundays here. And I'd ride out to the lake on the edge of town, or to various spots where I'd go and take photographs of an afternoon for as long as I felt comfortable in a place before I sort of got on the bike and got out of there and went to another place.
Did you fall in love with the culture and the people, the Afghanis? Did you must have felt some affinity living there that long with them? Yeah,
very much so. And I think that was something that surprised me about Afghanistan. I thought, given all the trouble that foreigners had brought Afghanistan over the years.
Such a complex situation, isn't it?
Yeah. I thought that we wouldn't be very welcome, but that certainly wasn't the case. And I was, constantly surprised by how hospitable Afghans were. You could barely walk down the street without getting called out to and invited in for tea or for lunch. And that is something very inherent in Afghan culture, and it's not only it transcends political affiliation. So if the same really goes for across the spectrum of the political divides from the government to anti-government.
So you're saying that is part of the Afghani culture, regardless of whether they're pro-government, anti-government, or whatever. It's
very much so.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Interesting. So was the work that you were doing over there, was most of it war-related? Was that the photography side of things? That's what was paying the bills?
I think in the end there, everything is somewhat war-related when it comes to news coverage, because even if you're photographing or writing a story about, say, the Afghan cricket team, it inevitably comes back to the challenges that they're facing being a cricket team in a country at war. All those players, or many of those players, grew up as refugees from war before 2001. They came back after the American invasion and brought cricket with them. And now they're struggling to maintain or to attract competition, because no other international teams want to come to Afghanistan. So everything, the war and Afghanistan are somewhat
permeates through everything.
Exactly, they can be hard to separate. So it was very rare that you would photograph something that didn't have some kind of link to the conflict.
In terms of conflict, you had a reputation for getting out on the streets and having access to all sides, like not just you weren't that journalist that just embedded themselves with the military forces and took photos from their perspective. You got out and about. Was that something you did consciously, or did that just evolve?
It just evolved as well, I think, because it was I arrived at a time when the international forces were really scaling down their operations. Excuse me, and the kind of access that had been available to international forces up until 2014 was no longer, and that was that was the lens through which I had seen Afghanistan up until that point to a large extent. It was. As we would all remember, they're probably the lasting image, the lasting kind of photos and video footage we have of Afghanistan or of the international involvement there, that being camouflage-clad soldiers walking through dusty villages, kicking indoors or flying in helicopters and so on, and rather than the Afghanistan or Afghans themselves. And so once that was no longer on the table, the other option was to go and tell stories through the eyes of Afghans themselves, the Afghans who were had experienced the war that was led by the international forces, which had now been taken over by the Afghan security forces and being fought against the Taliban. The Afghan security forces would, on occasion, allow media access. But it was never the kind that that me or many other journalists were satisfied by. It would, they'd kind of bring us in for a day or a few hours and for a bit of a junket, show something off that they wanted to be seen. But you never really got to spend the good chunks of time like those that were available to journalists in the early years of the war with the foreign forces. And then, of course, on the Taliban side, it was almost unheard of to spend time in Taliban territory or with the Taliban up until the very last years and months of the war. Yeah.
And the Taliban, did they look at, and this is probably a general question, too broad, but how was their attitude towards foreign journalists? But we're talking pre-August 15.
Generally speaking, it wasn't friendly. It was very... I mean, to me, up until the first time I was officially allowed into Taliban territory to work, which was in 2020, I felt there was a huge gap in my work there, which represented probably 50% of the country that was controlled by the Taliban, which I couldn't access. The closest I would ever get to the Taliban was from bases or checkpoints being controlled by the Afghan government security forces, and looking through a sniper hole, and you could maybe see a Taliban flag waving, 100 meters away or 200 meters away, or driving through contested areas to get from one place to another, and you could see Taliban flags off in the distance, I guess getting shot at now and then by Taliban.
Okay. But 2020, how did you negotiate going into Taliban territory?
So at the beginning of 2020, the Americans signed an agreement with the Taliban in Doha, Qatar, that
they would be withdrawing.
Exactly. Yeah. In exchange for the Americans agreeing to set out their timetable for withdrawal, the Taliban would disavow their connection to Al-Qaeda. They would agree to they would plan peace talks with the Afghan government and several other items on this in this agreement. But it also put the Taliban or gave the Taliban a spotlight in the international media that they hadn't really had before. They were getting time on on CNN and in the New York Times, and they had a much more public facing role.
So that was a bit of their PR.
They were getting they were getting PR with their political leaders, and at the same time, I think they wanted to try and whitewash their reputation to an extent. And so they started opening up their areas to journalists. It wasn't like the floodgates didn't open or anything. It was like they'd let one in here, one in there,
and it was controlled, supervised.
It was pretty controlled. But I mean, not to the extent that it wasn't worth doing. And so it was pretty fascinating, and it was still kind of risky. Like, we didn't really have that many assurances. If something went wrong, no one was coming to get us.
I just on a personal point of view, you'd have to feel vulnerable in those situations. Like, you're putting your trust into an organisation that you don't know, what their true intentions are. How did that feel for you personally? Like, when we're going to meet this person. Did you go in there with a degree of trepidation?
Yeah, for sure. But you also had to have a good read of the climate at the time, and realise that it probably wouldn't benefit the Taliban at that point to take a hostage and a foreign hostage, because it was at a point where they were trying to show the world that that it wouldn't be such a bad thing if Afghanistan came under their control again, and that to give the Americans every reason to keep the withdrawal happening according to plan, and to eventually leave and to abandon the Afghan government. They wanted to give the world and the Americans every reason to continue
follow the course that was set by the Doha Agreement.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so, we had to be aware of that as well, not being used by the Taliban for their own advantage. You have to be very cautious that you're taking those kinds of things into account when you're going into their areas and reporting on it.
You don't want to, because we're all susceptible to flattery or whatever, and if they brought you in and treated you like someone great, and then you report this back, you could be a little bit naive in your coverage there.
Very much so.
So, look, I think now's probably a good time to take a break. We get a sense of how you found yourself in Afghanistan, how you fell in love with photography and journalism. When we get back, we're going to talk more specifically about that crucial time, that August in Kabul, hence the name of your book, and some extracts from that. And I'd really like to talk about, because there's some of the things in the books about really personal experiences from people of how it impacted on them when the change of who was running the country. So thanks for your first part. I'm looking forward to the second part.
Excellent.
Cheers.